Hey, Christ Community Church. Pastor Tim here this week to bring another installment of our weekly look at each of the 10 commandments. We are on commandment number 4 this week, which has to do with the biblical Sabbath day. And the key text for us today, naturally, Exodus 20, verses 8 to 11. Actually, the commandment is what we're going to see in verse 8. The following verses, 9, 10, and 11, are what you might call supporting verses. Moses wrote them to clarify the commandment and to offer some further explanation. So let's look at the fourth commandment. Verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Now, there's a couple things to point out in this command of God. First, what does Sabbath mean? Well, the Hebrew word Shabbat, it means rest. You see, God's desire for his people was that they intentionally observe a regular day of rest. God designed us to be, he wired us to be industrious, creative, and productive people, but he also designed in us a need for recuperative rest. Now, we're going to come back to this, but for now, understand, God wants us to take a day off, and he wants us to do so regularly. Notice next that God says, remember the Sabbath day, and then he adds, to keep it holy. Keeping it holy means that they were supposed to set aside this day of rest as special, a day that was different from the other days of the week, a day each week that might be dedicated to the Lord. So to paraphrase, God is saying to the people of Israel, I want you to schedule a day off regularly, and I want that day to be very special. And then there's one last thing to look at before we move into the rest of the passage. Look again at the first word. God says, remember the Sabbath. Don't forget the Sabbath. Now, I don't know if you've ever noticed that of the 10 commandments, 8 of them are given as negatives, negative imperatives. For example, you know them. You shall not kill. You shall not steal. You shall not covet. But nestled in there among those 8 no-nos are 2 more positively voiced commands. Remember the Sabbath, and then next week's command, honor your father and your mother. Now, God could have said, you shall not forget the Sabbath to keep it holy, and you shall not dishonor your father and your mother. That way, all 10 of the commandments would have been in the same voice, albeit negative. Now don't get me wrong. Even though they're expressed in a negative voice, all of God's commandments are good, and they are good for us. Just imagine how much better our lives would be if all of us were able to perfectly follow the 10 commandments. Anyway, back to today's commandment. We are instructed to remember the Sabbath. God wants us to take a regularly scheduled day off and keep it for him, right? Reserve it for him to keep it holy. Now let's look further at Moses' deeper explanation of the Sabbath day. Moses goes on in verse 9. He says, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. Verse 11, for in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the 7th day. Therefore, the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. So I notice here that God adds clear instruction to the frequency, as to the frequency of our holy day of rest. It's not monthly, it's not quarterly, it's not annually, it's not whenever we feel like remembering to rest. No, God wants us to rest weekly. Yeah, 1 day out of every 7 days. We are to work 6 days and then rest 1. Work 6 days and then rest 1. He's describing a regular and repeated work-rest rhythm. Next, notice in verse 10 how well he defines the Sabbath day. And notice especially the way he describes the scope of who's involved here. Nobody is to do any work on the Sabbath. Not you, not your kids, not your servants, not your guests, not even your animals, for crying out loud, your livestock. Again, God knows his people very well. He knows our tendency to try to find workarounds. I mean, we can say, okay, God, I'll rest on the Sabbath, but my employees can still work, right? I mean, there's work to get done, and we can't afford to get a day behind. God says, no, the Sabbath day is a day of rest that I want for you and also everyone. It's to be our regular, holy day off, and it is for everybody. You know, I believe God also wants us to use this Sabbath rest as a reminder for us to acknowledge His provision. He is our great provider, right? He knows how we might obsess about the loss of productivity, about the loss of revenue that would result from that weekly day off. But ultimately, we are reminded that God provides according to our needs. He's the one that brings the harvest. He is the one that brings the increase. You know, I can't help but think of Chick-fil-A, you know, the restaurant company. They are still closed every Sunday to observe the Sabbath, and yet they remain the third largest fast food company in the country. You know, I believe God honors and blesses that company's decision to remember the Sabbath. And then finally, God addresses the biblical and historical basis for this commandment. In verse 11, He bases the Sabbath on His own creative work, referring to the 6 days in which He created heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them. This part of the commandment is taken from Genesis 2, verses 2 to 3. Where He says, on the seventh day, God finished His work that He had done, and He rested on the seventh day from the work that He had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all of His work that He had done in creation. Brothers and sisters, when God blesses something, He makes it rich and wonderful. When He blesses a person, that person is made abundantly joyful and prosperous. When He blesses a nation or a land, that land is made rich and plentiful. So when He blesses a day, likewise, that day becomes rich with blessings for His people. As I said a few moments ago, all of God's commandments are good. And most importantly, they are for our good. God's day of Sabbath rest really is a gift to us, and we are to set aside that gift as a special day to focus on Him, to give Him the special attention, well, that only He deserves, to bask in His goodness and love and grace. It's a day each week for us to thank our God, to worship our God, to bless Him, to honor Him, to enjoy Him, and to delight in Him. So let's not miss out on the rich blessings God wants to bestow on us when we observe the Sabbath day each week. Let's remember to keep it holy, setting it aside for Him, for His good pleasure, and for our own good. That's a brief look at commandment number 4. I'm Tim Arrington. I hope you all have a blessed week, and we will see you on the Sabbath. Until then, take care. Bye-bye.